So if you're joining us as a guest, we've been almost a year now into a class on a biblical theology of government and politics, and we are going through a section on the history of the church and particularly the history of Christians' interactions with their earthly governments and earthly politics. And last week, Tom talked to us about the Reformation, I believe, which is, thank you, Tom, for doing that, which is a big topic. Just to review actually the last couple of months, we talked about the first 300 years of the church under the Roman Empire. They experienced pretty intense persecution up until the year 312 AD. And then the Rome officially embraces Christianity, but then Rome falls to barbarians only about 160 years later. And as civilization, Roman civilization caves in, the church becomes the only institution that holds together and preserves knowledge of just about everything, including preserving Scripture. And so, because society is kind of because the church is the only stable institution in society, secular society begins to look more and more to the church for order and for leadership. And as the church's influence and resources grow, along with that comes temptations that always come along with power and resources. We talked in the last month or so that the political power of the church and the Pope peaks. The high water mark is around 1200 AD, and then kind of slowly goes into decline after that. So that's all review. And then last week, you all talked about the Reformation, which was one of the great earthquakes in the history of the church, which is why we now have a Protestant church and a Roman Catholic church, and talked about some of the dynamics that went into that. So any thoughts from last week or the last couple of months that you've been chewing on that you want to get out? Just to circle back a little bit to the Reformation briefly one more time, and even to the period that we call the Middle Ages, which beginning in the 1800s they started calling them the Dark Ages. They weren't called that before. The term Dark Ages was a pejorative term or kind of a term of insult to take all of that time period and say it was a time of worthless, superstitious darkness. There was a specific agenda behind that, and we're going to talk more about that. But contrary to the really popular modern myth, the false modern myth, that the Middle Ages were just this time of ignorance and darkness, that's not true. Actually, all of the best aspects of our modern forms of government were hashed out in that time period as the church was trying to figure out what does it look like for the society to be a good society now that we know that Christ is King. Right? What does a proper relationship look like between God's law and human governmental law? So all of those conversations began even before the Middle Ages. They began as soon as the book of Acts closed. But to say that this was a time period of just ignorance and darkness is just not. It's just not true. All of the rule-based system that we have, the constitutional rule-based system, the rights-based system, all of those conversations were already very much taking place in the Middle Ages. Does that make sense? So this morning, we talked about the idea that prior to Jesus, pretty much everybody in the world thought that their leaders had some stamp of the divine or some connection to the divine. And so kings were usually thought of as appointed by the gods, and nations were connected to religious status. After Jesus came, those claims were now hollow because Jesus is the only king, right? Okay, so you talked last week about the Reformation. Luther wasn't trying to start a new church, he was trying to reform the church from within, but as things go, they ended up booting him out, and the Reformation was born. The Reformation is, I think this is fair to say, one of four great sort of watershed moments in the 2,000-year history of the church and its relationship to the state. The first one we talked about was Constantine, right, in 300 AD. The second one we talked about some of the wrangling between the popes and the emperors. The third one is the Reformation, and then we'll talk about the fourth one later. But the Reformation did splinter the church. It went from being one unified body, even though there were a lot of divisions within that unified body, to eventually being a situation where we have dozens and now today thousands. I think the last count, there's like 45,000 denominations in the globally, which, and this did make people in general more skeptical of the church as a source, as a one voice for universal truth, and the radical pluralism which we see in the West today did become more plausible, more believable with the splintering of the church. I'm not saying I believe the Protestant Reformation was a good thing, but there's hard consequences to it also. At the same time, and this is the political side of things, individual nations were springing up, were growing in their power and their influence, and resented the control of the church or the influence of the church. And so the Reformation, as it weakened the church as a universal body, individual nation states became more powerful and more prominent. And people began to look less to a universal church and more to their individual nation state for their identity. Does that make sense? And then, this is sort of review from last week too, that the Reformation influenced these growing movements of nation states, and the nation states also influenced the Reformation. As an example, many leaders, especially in Germany, they embraced Lutheranism not so much because they were deep theological scholars and deep students of the Bible, but oftentimes it was more to gain independence from the power of the church or the Holy Roman Empire. So it was more political than theological often. Luther is a perfect example of that. Luther received protection from some powerful governmental leaders. In Germany was made up of hundreds of, it wasn't one unified nation like we think of today. It was hundreds of little nation states, some of them more powerful, some of them less powerful. And some of them protected Luther and kept him from getting executed. And so that's what I mean when I say they influenced the Reformation as well. You could also look at, I think you talked last week about Henry VIII. Henry VIII, remember, he's the King of England who wanted a divorce because his wife wasn't producing any sons. And he was Roman Catholic, all of England was. The church would not grant him a divorce because they said you have no justification under God's law for getting a divorce. And so he said, well, I'm going to become the head of the church now in England. And so it wasn't a theological reason at all. He probably wasn't that interested in theology. He just wanted a new wife who would produce a son for him. So that's a good example of situations. They weren't that theologically motivated. They were more politically motivated. I'm not saying that Luther was very much theologically motivated, very much motivated by the Bible. But a lot of the people who came in the train of the Reformation were often motivated as much by politics as they were by theology. Does that make sense? Okay. So with the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had a strong response or reaction to the Protestant Reformation. It's called the Counter-Reformation. We're still in the 1500s, in the time shortly following the Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church really focused on I think internally they knew they had a whole lot of corruption. And so they focused on trying to root out corruption in their own ranks, having a really robust, muscular theological response to Protestantism. The famous church council is called the Council of Trent, and almost every way they dug in their heels theologically, they doubled down on things like indulgences and the authority of the Pope, but they did try to do some internal reform of their own corruption. They also kind of redoubled their efforts at missions and outreach of the church's message, the Catholic Church's message. So they redoubled their efforts. It was a time of real bold activism among the Catholic Church, the Counter-Reformation, which led to the Inquisition, which is a lot of its ugliness, of executing Protestants and persecuting people who did not fall in line with traditional Roman Catholic doctrine. Well, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this unless you have some big questions about it. But the results were, and this map kind of shows, that a lot of Northern Europe becomes Protestant. So the yellow areas are Protestant areas. That was much of what we think of today as Germany, England, the Scandinavian countries, Scotland, Holland. A lot of Southern Europe stayed Roman Catholic, the main countries being Italy and Spain and France, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was really powerful at the time. Basically, a region's religion was determined by its ruler. They didn't have anything like freedom of religion of what we think of today. You had a state church in all of these areas. And so many people, if you were a Protestant in a Catholic country, a lot of those people would flee to Protestant areas, and vice versa. If you were a devout Catholic and you found yourself in a Protestant country, you might flee to a Catholic area. And so the political fallout of all of this, a lot of these small city-state rulers, they support Luther's movement, again, because they want to get out from under the thumb of the Pope and his political influence. a lot of the local rulers choose whether their nation and all of their people are going to be Catholic or Lutheran or Protestant. You have a lot of, there's a major peasant revolt in Germany, and which killed a lot of people. Protestantism often becomes associated with rebellion against the powerful church and the crown, and the church and the crown comes to be seen as kind of traditional. And I was just talking about this with Seth. Protestants come to be seen as more revolutionary because they're changing forms of government to be more populist, more parliamentary. Okay, so all of that may seem dry and and dusty. I do want to say that what we're going to talk about next is really, really interesting, and you might wonder, why in the world is he banging on about this? Because this was 400 years ago, and what does it have to do with us? But what we're going to talk about, actually, all of the Protestant stuff, the Reformation, and what we're going to talk about next, I would argue is profoundly relevant today to things that we still believe and things that are active controversies, active debates today. We're going to spend quite a bit of time, maybe the rest of the morning, talking about what's come to be known as the wars of religion, because these become justification for why we need to have no religion involved in state in governmental politics today. And I'm going to argue that all of that is a false narrative, that the wars of religion weren't even really mainly about religion, and that narrative, that false narrative, has got so much traction, became such a pervasive myth that almost everybody in the West believes today. So we've talked about this before. If there's a public policy debate in Congress and someone says, well, the Bible says this, you're going to get laughed out of the room, right? Because the Bible is not taken as a credible, it's thought to be, it should be disqualified. Religion should be disqualified from having anything to say about a public policy debate. Why does almost everybody in the West believe that automatically? It's just part of the wallpaper, part of the backdrop to what everybody believes. Why do people believe that? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. This narrative didn't come from nowhere. It came from a very specific set of arguments related to what's known as the wars of religion. So we're going to talk about that this morning. So what's commonly called the wars of religion, the main war associated with this it's called the 30 Years' War. If you notice the date, it's 1618 to 1648, 30 years. How long is this after the Protestant Reformation that this starts?
100 years.
Almost exactly 100 years, right? So the Protestant Reformation is 1517. 101 years later, the 30 Years' War starts. The 30 Years' War was probably the only thing comparable in Western history to World War I and World War II, because it pulled in the whole continent of Europe, 8 million casualties, about 15% of Europe died during the 30 Years' War. In many of the German areas, 50% of all men died during the 30 Years' War. It was a brutal 30-year period of war and devastation. And popular myth today, that myth started in the 1700s, but popular myth says that these wars of religion are solely blamed on the religious conflicts that came out of the Reformation, right? So the Reformation is Protestants splitting off from Catholics and then them fighting each other, and that's what gave us these wars, and so they're called wars of religion. Does that make sense? I'm going to make a strong case that, and it's not just me. There's a lot of contemporary historians who are reevaluating this whole narrative, and that it really shouldn't even be called wars of religion. This argument is a reductionist, dishonest, revisionary account of what actually happened historically and why. So the myth that conflict mainly comes from strong religious belief or strong convictions. Right? You hear that myth today that it's people who have strong belief that are dangerous. It's people, particularly strong religious belief is dangerous to the stability of society. It's going to produce conflict. It's going to produce even war. Do you hear that? That's one of the justifications given for why we should keep religion out of politics, right? That narrative sprang up after these wars and was blamed on these wars. Does that make sense? This false narrative that has become almost universally believed, that the Reformation and the splintering of the church led directly to the 30 Years' War and the infamous wars of religion, with various groups of Christians slaughtering one another and hashing it out for doctrinal supremacy. Does this make sense? Okay. So I'm going to talk about why that's a false narrative, even though it's incredibly powerful today. So in this narrative, religion poses, and Christianity in particular, poses a unique danger to the peace and stability of society. Religion is uniquely dangerous, which is why it specifically needs to be kept out of politics, right? Why it's inherently more dangerous than, say, other things that we might bring into the political debate, right? What's the main thing people in a policy debate today, say in Washington, D.C. or in Lincoln at the Capitol? What's the primary justifications that people use for policy debates? What do they give as their justification for their policy debates? That's the most common smokescreen, I would say, that's thrown out there, is just trust the science. As if, COVID, for example, as if the science had one unified voice, right? It didn't. There were scientists on this side and scientists on that side and scientists on the other side. There was the idea that there is the science is another myth that we believe, right? And that the idea that someone would bring in a religious argument to that debate was thought of as ridiculous, right? And again, that religion is particularly pernicious, particularly dangerous, particularly liable to cause conflict, right? So we're going to ask the question, was the 30 Years' War actually a religious war? Today, again, serious scholars of this period are really reevaluating this time period. Why? So we said that again, if you can keep the dates straight, 1517 is the Protestant Reformation. 100 years later to the start of the 100 Years' War. In 15, I'll come to the date in a minute. About 40 years after the Protestant Reformation in 1517, Protestant faith had become widely established, particularly throughout Northern Europe. And the Catholic Holy Roman Empire decided that it needed to come to peace politically, militarily, with this new situation. They couldn't just be fighting it with armies. And so in 1555, that's less than 40 years after the Reformation started, the Holy Roman Emperor announces what's called the Peace of Augsburg, which was a political document that granted tolerance to Protestant nations. They said we're not going to try to wipe them off the face of the map, basically. And here's an actual quote, key quote from this act, this document, the Peace of Augsburg. It says, this is the Holy Roman Emperor of the Catholic Church speaking. He says, "We will not make war upon any estate of the empire on account of their Protestant faith, nor shall we trouble them, but shall let them quietly and peacefully enjoy their religion. A complete peace within the disputed Christian religion shall be attained only by Christian-friendly and peaceful means." So this became the official law of the empire. Most of that document, I think it was a fairly lengthy document. The majority of it is dedicated to trying to hash out what this is going to look like in terms of economics and the law and the court system and police and civil issues, right? But based on an attempt to have a peaceful resolution to this religious conflict. The Peace of Augsburg held for over 60 years, which is pretty remarkable, actually. 63 years from the Peace of Augsburg until the 30 Years' War started. What finally broke that lengthy period of peace? The 30 Years' War did. Why did the 30 Years' War start? The 30 Years' War was mainly about not religion so much, but more about nation states wanting to break free of their political independence from the Holy Roman Empire. So, for example, if we think of nations today, we think of big nations like Germany or the US or France. Most of these little nation states might have been 10 square miles or 20 square miles, right? And they each had their jurisdiction and they each had their king and their leader. But as these nation states grew and bumped into their neighbors, what's one way that if you're worried about your neighbor taking your stuff, what's one way that you deal with that? You go hit him first, right? And that's also true for nation states, right? You preemptive strike. And so you had all of these nation states, you have technology, so you have technology of military technology, and communications technology where one king actually can control larger and larger swaths of territory. And so what you see is all these little nation states bumping into each other, grinding together, and some of them swallowing up others, and the strong ones taking the stuff from the weak ones, taking the territory from the weak ones. And you see this sort of, we'll use this process again, survival of the fittest, this Darwinist process where the big animal eats the little animal, right? The strong one eats the weak. And that's largely what actually led to the 30 Years' War, is all of these nation states kind of grinding against each other. And if you look at the combatants of the 30 Years' War, very often you have Catholic and Protestant kings allied together fighting against other Catholic and Protestant kings. You have Catholics fighting against Catholics. You have Protestants fighting against Protestants. And the main thing they're fighting about is not what they're reading in their Bible. The main thing they're fighting about is, I want your land before you take mine, right? I want to control your land so you don't control. So now they were all religious, so you can't really disentangle the religion from the conflict, because everybody was religious. But the source, the core things that they were fighting about, it wasn't theology. It was mainly about land and territory and power. Does that make sense?
Never heard of such a thing.
Yeah. Imagine that, right? So the two main combatants in the 30 Years' War ended up being the French Catholics versus the Austro-Hungarian Catholics. And the French had Protestant allies and the Austro-Hungarians had Protestant allies. But it wasn't Protestants fighting against Catholics. It was a whole mix of different people allied to each other, some strange allies based not on theology, but based on territorial concerns. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Would they use their religion as an excuse for their purpose?
I'm sure they would justify what they were doing,
Yeah.
because we still do that today, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, even non-religious people, use moral arguments to justify, which are essentially religious arguments, right? So they would have said, God's on our side, not on their side. But they weren't really fighting, again, they weren't fighting about Bible verses. They were fighting about acreages, right? Does that make sense? So, this is the answer to your question. Religion played a part because religion was part of everything, right? There was nobody who was secular, virtually nobody. But it wasn't primarily a religious war. It was primarily a political, territorial war of power over territory. Are you tracking with me? Does that make sense? Okay. So, in fact, if you look at surviving sermons, pastors, well, they still do this. They write out their sermons, and a lot of those sermons survive. And most of the sermons that survive from that time period are pastors and priests actually critical of the war, actually encouraging people toward repentance of their sins and prayer that God will bring this bloody disaster to an end. Right? They're not saying, hey, we should win because God's on our side. They're mostly saying, let's all repent and hope that God will end this terrible war that we're in. Does that make sense? So, yeah, like we said, approximately 15% of the population of Europe died in this 30-year period. So finally, the 30-year war came to an end, and the peace treaty that was signed at the end of the war was called the Peace of Westphalia, and signed in 1648 by the main combatant nations who were fighting each other in this war. And most historians today view the Peace of Westphalia as sort of the birth of our modern system of nation states, where the nation state has its own sovereign territory and its own sovereign leadership, and the Holy Roman Empire basically dissolves. And it's also modern in the sense that it was built on the same principles of tolerance that were established under the Peace of Augsburg almost 100 years earlier. In other words, we're not going to attack you because of your religion. Nations are always attacking each other, right? Wars are not new. They're probably not going away. But it's mainly about things that have to do with stuff, right? So the Peace of Westphalia was not the false narrative, the false myth is that these nations all decided to secularize, and that's why they stopped fighting, is because they suddenly not got religion, they suddenly lost religion. That's not actually true either. Everybody remained deeply religious, but they weren't primarily fighting about religion anyway. Instead, it's these nations acknowledging that these nation states are here to stay, and we're not going to try to have one holy Roman Catholic empire. Thoughts on that? I realize this is a lot. This is drinking from the fire hose, but and why does this matter? That'll become more clear in just a minute. Yeah.
So, if it seems obvious that it wasn't over mainly theology, how did it get misconstrued?
Yeah, we're coming to that. It's a great question. You're thinking right on track, so that's good. We'll get to that in about maybe 3 slides. So as we said, the brutal fighting of the 30 Years' War was much more about kings forcibly consolidating their power from small local kingdoms to much larger nations governed centrally. There were Protestants versus Catholics, yes, but there was also Protestants against Protestants and Catholics against Catholics. Everyone was religious, and yet the 30 Years' War becomes the poster child for the justification for why religion should be left out, because religion is inherently violent, right? The war ended in just utter exhaustion of the parties because they had lost so many men. Okay, now we're coming to the answer to your question. So this is some of the bitter fruit that we live with up to this very moment in Western politics. The bitter fruit of the wars of the 1600s. So the two guys on the left, this is Voltaire. He lived in the 1700s. Locke was British, lived in the 1600s. We'll come to the third guy in a minute. They began to sort of write the history, the popular history of what had happened. And Voltaire was an atheist, a French atheist, and was an evangelist. I use that word intentionally. He was an evangelist for atheism, an evangelist for against religion, right? Why religion is a bad thing and people should not be religious anymore. And so he is very effective at writing tracts and writing pamphlets and delivering speeches and peeling off religion as the main source of the conflict in the 30 Years' War. Locke comes up with a similar theory that this popular myth that's perpetuated by Voltaire and others, it becomes the justification for modern government systems which have a specific embargo against religion in public politics, in political discussions or discussions of policy. Anybody know who the guy on the right is? That's Thomas Jefferson. He had a bust. In the entrance to his house, he had a bust to Voltaire and a bust, bronze bust to both of those men. He said that they were his two most famous influences, or the two most influential guys in his political thinking. So Thomas Jefferson becomes a main voice when America's trying to get their system going of, again, a hard separation between church and state, and why the church should be left out of the state, and we should just have a secular state and not bring all this messy, troublesome, quarrelsome religion into our governments. They should remain secular. Does that make sense? So, the real winner, if there were any winners, was the nation state, right? And secularism, whose evangelists like Locke and Voltaire. Locke was not an atheist. Locke was actually a religious person, but Voltaire was clearly an atheist, and they sort of won the popular debate in pinning all of the problems of the 30 Years' War on religion. So this new view that governments should be secular, that they should be neutral toward questions of good or bad. So Locke primarily was saying that these questions about what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, value questions, those are unsolvable. We can't solve those, and so we're just going to leave those outside of the circle. We're going to draw a big circle, and inside the circle is going to be secular politics and science, and outside the circle is going to be religion, and we're going to make that circle really, the walls around that circle really tight so religion can't get in, because if religion gets in, it's unsolvable, and it's going to cause conflict. We can't answer those questions anyway, because those are theological and metaphysical questions. So we're just going to, when we do government, we're just going to deal with nuts and bolts and facts and science and reason. Right? That was the argument. What's wrong basically with that argument? Right. Everybody, whether you're an atheist or a fundamentalist Christian, you have a belief about what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. So did anybody watch the Nebraska legislature, a year or two ago? They were debating the law about banning surgeries for minors. Anybody watch the clips of the woman who was she's screaming? If that's not religion, I don't know what it is. She's screaming and emotional and chanting, trans lives matter, she would not acknowledge it, but she's a deeply religious person. Her beliefs are not based on science. Right? They're deeply held beliefs about what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, that have nothing to do with science. They are religious ideas. They're just kind of smuggled in the back door. They're not acknowledged as religion, but they're very much ideas about good and bad. What is a human being? They're not neutral ideas. They're not rational, scientific beliefs. They're religious beliefs. She just wouldn't acknowledge them as such. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The Outback Steakhouse, no rules, just right. Great idea. Only problem is,
Right.
doesn't work.
To make any laws that govern society, you're basing your laws on some version of what's good for humans versus what's bad for humans, right? Laws against stealing because nobody wants to have their stuff stolen. Right? Laws against assault or rape, or we have laws against these things because we think they're morally wrong. You can't build laws on anything else except moral arguments. So we are going to bring moral arguments, but somehow we're supposed to leave religious arguments out. It's a big sham is what it is, because people are going to bring moral arguments and arguments about what is a human being and what is a good way for human beings to live versus what's a bad way of human beings to live. Yeah.
Well, I even think science, right? Like that is so manipulative to say,
Right.
we stand by science because it's like, yeah, no Lord ordained that. So
Right.
let's process through what that actually looks like. And so
Right.
it's a mask that doesn't fit when people
Right.
say to support science.
And even science can tell us how to make a nuclear bomb. It shouldn't tell us whether or not we should use it, when and where and how we should use it, right? Those are questions that are religious, philosophical questions. COVID, the science might be able to tell you exactly how many people are going to die if we do these, but it shouldn't tell you what the balance should be between absolute security versus... Those aren't questions that maybe science can answer the statistical, but even if it can answer the statistical, it can't tell you how we should balance those things, right? I'm dubious if it can even answer the statistical thing until it's looking back 50 years, right? Yeah.
If they truly lived out the ideas of, keeping the walls high
Mm-hmm.
for their circle, they really wouldn't have a lot to talk about in their circle.
Right. That's why I say it's kind of a big sham, really. It's a dishonest argument that we're not allowing moral conversations into our legislating discussions. Yeah.
I mean, bad ideas having consequences. It may be a sham, but people today have been conditioned to respond a certain way to certain types of religion.
It's a very powerful sham, a very pervasive sham.
Those walls are very real to certain types of religion.
Right. And even Christians, we hesitate to try to scale those walls, right? Yeah, it's a very powerful myth, even though it is a myth, right? So again, it's not even theologically neutral. To have a neutral government that takes no position on right or wrong, like you even have to decide, well, what's theological or what's religious or not, right? That's a theological debate. So then the state gets to determine what's religious and allowed in, what's religious and forbidden, what's not religious and allowed to come over the wall, right? So some takeaways from this. I think there is a tragedy. On net, I'm a Protestant Christian. I believe in all of the principles of the Protestant Reformation. But I still think it's a tragedy that Christians weren't able to work this out, that we have 45,000 denominations, because most of those splits were not, they weren't amicable splits, right? So like even churches today that split, hardly ever is that a positive thing, a positive portrait of Christ in the community, right? So, and we do have today in the West a radical form of pluralism which says there is no right or wrong, there is no good or bad, it's just whatever your truth is your truth, right? And people really didn't think that way in the Middle Ages. They believed that there was one truth. We just had to figure out, it was God's truth, and we had to figure out what that was. But today, the West has a, not just, we should tolerate our neighbors that we don't like. We shouldn't try to kill them. But that doesn't mean that we agree to have your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, right? Everyone makes up their own personal truth. Have it your way. What was the slogan?
No rules.
No rules, just right. Yeah. That's a very American, modern, Western, pluralistic thing to say. Everybody makes up their own personal truth. So now we're in a situation politically where there's incredible confusion and incredible polarization with people on the left and the right religiously holding to their values, which they don't acknowledge as religious. Does that make sense? And we don't even know how to have the conversation. So Christians do bear real responsibility for this. When Christian unity shatters and splinters, the world sees and the gospel witness does suffer. That's true on a local level. When a church fractures and splits, we lose credibility when that happens, right? At the same time, this is also true that there are cynical men like Voltaire who have an agenda and these events to craft a false narrative for their own political purposes that try to bracket out, that try to forbid specifically religion because they don't want Christian ideas being part of the conversation, right? So ultimately, anytime you're making any kind of public policy decision, you're pulling from deep beliefs about what is a good human life, what is life for, what is human life, is there anything unique about humans, right? It's impossible to pull out, to untangle the threads and pull out religious threads from any kind of public policy debate. So it's a dishonest reading of history, and it's a dishonest, it's a failure to acknowledge what's actually happening now, right? that people are bringing in debates all the time that aren't scientific, that aren't pure reason, that are values loaded, if that makes sense. So secular states today and secular nations that are governed by supposedly neutral, value-free, rational, scientific, enlightenment views of religion. So this whole argument was that religion causes violence, right? What's been the most violent wars of the last 100 years? Or the violent purges in nations? They're not, we killed more people in the 20th century than the previous 19 centuries combined. Those wars weren't religious wars. So we're really good at killing each other, even without religion or theology coming into the equation at all, right? In the 20th century, Stalin, the avowed atheist, killed roughly 30 million of his own people. Mao killed roughly 40 million of his own people. Pol Pot, avowed atheist, killed 1/4 of his population in trying to bring in a pure rationalist, non-religious religion. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. Right. The whole notion that religion is somehow particularly violent and dangerous is just ignoring the reality of what is, right?
Well, and I think too, this helps with knock out easy believism real quick, right? Like that, it's not like type A amen and you're blessed, you know, it's, this is real Christianity and real faith.
Right.
And it shows throughout, you know, all of history how
Yeah.
we have to be steadfast as believers and get ready for persecution, whatever that looks like.
Right. Yeah, the Bible sort of treats, well, in this world you will have trouble, right? That's sort of the default, which we forget, right? But be of good heart, I have overcome the world, right? About this, yeah, Susan.
I did not come to bring peace. but
Right,
sword.
a sword, yeah.
How did-
Beliefs do divide
Yes.
because they do matter, right? Like, it matters whether I believe human life is unique or not unique. And every belief is going to put some people on this side of the line and some people on the other side of the line. That beliefs do matter. But we can't therefore say, well, we're not going to have beliefs in this conversation because we don't have anything else except beliefs, right? Yeah.
Were there Christians speaking out against Voltaire at the time? Like, I'm sure there's pamphlets going around.
Yeah, there were. Why he got unique traction for his ideas, I'm not sure. So it's interesting you bring that up. So he was writing. He died, I think, 2 years before the French Revolution started, which pretty much discredited all of his, or should have discredited. It didn't discredit his ideas. It should have discredited all, because the French Revolution was an avowed atheist religion. The Notre Dame Cathedral, they tore down the statue of Mary and put up a statue to the goddess of reason. And then they killed a massive swath of the French population in the name of rationality, right? So in the name of rational, religion-free, secular government, we will bomb you into rationality. Right? We will crush you until you...
How does that work?
Yeah, right, exactly. So here's a thought experiment. For if someone tells you that religion is uniquely dangerous, religion is uniquely a source of violence, ask them this question. Say, do you know more people who'd be willing to kill their neighbors or somebody from another country in the name of Jesus? Or more people who would be willing to kill in the name of Uncle Sam? Well, that's pretty obvious. Most people would say, I'm not going to kill somebody in the name of Jesus, but I would kill somebody from my country. And there, again, I'm not saying wars can be justified. There's justifiable reasons for using force, for going to war. But there's not something uniquely violent about Christianity. People are very good at killing each other without having religious justification for it.
Well, Jesus is the polar opposite of that. I'll give myself up.
Yeah, right. Which is not to say, someone last week thought that my sermon was, that I was endorsing pacifism. I'm not a pacifist. I believe there is justification for force, that there's justification for military force, there's justification for police force, because we live in a fallen world and people don't just do the right thing because they want to do the right thing, right? So I believe in the death penalty. I believe in the military because a country has to be able to defend itself. It has to have borders that they can defend, right? So this is not a pacifist argument. This is an argument that that secularism is not uniquely peaceful and religion is not uniquely violent. In fact, I would make the case that historically you could say the opposite. Not that Christians have never been involved in conflict. They have, obviously. And there are legitimate reasons for Christians to be involved in conflict, right? Even capital force, right? To be involved in the military, because there are real bad guys who won't be stopped by quoting Bible verses at them, right? Right. So the Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, they justify the use. They say the government holds the sword. That's held up as a legitimate function of the government, is to use force against evil. That's what Paul says in Romans 13, right? So this is not a pacifist argument in any sense. Right? So this is a lot. We'll just finish up this thought. What would a genuine Christian tolerance look like today? What does it genuinely look like for Christians to have serious, real disagreements with other people? Even people who want to kill us. What does it look like? These are not easy. I'm not pretending these are easy answers, right? But what does a genuine Christian tolerance look like? What does it look like for Christians, denominations, people who love Jesus, to disagree sometimes sharply with each other over points of doctrine, and yet
We need to agree to disagree.
yeah, sometimes. Yeah, these aren't easy questions, but I think it's something we can think about deeply coming out of studying this period. Is what does it look like to disagree sharply but still have charity toward our neighbor, or unity toward our brother in Christ? What does it look like to live in a pluralistic society with non-believing neighbors who believe that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, right? These are just questions for thought.
We need the answers to that.
Come on.
Yeah, Darren.
Nathan, I'm guessing, just reading into it here, but did the person who said that, asking if you were endorsing pacifism, if you will, was that comment perhaps made because of what you shared about, does that mean that Christians should be willing to take up arms against their government?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, maybe you should restate what you shared.
Yeah, they're responding to that specific thought. Yeah, and my answer to that is I don't want people from our church randomly going to try to assassinate political leaders, Republican or Democrat or independent. Right? Like I think Romans 13 puts the bar pretty high for violent revolutions because Paul was living under Nero, who was way worse than any politician we've ever had. And Paul wasn't calling for violent revolution against his government, nor did Jesus. They lived under an unjust Roman system. It was not a good system. I mean, there were good things about it, but it was run by evil men. And yet Paul and Jesus don't call for violent revolution against their earthly government. I think that's the biblical model that we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament is that we have to have confidence that God will fight our battles, and that even if I die, Shadrach, Meshach, and even though you slay me, I'm going to trust in God. And it's a complicated question, which is not I'm not a pacifist. Again, I believe sometimes force is necessary, but I don't think the default model of the Bible is to authorize political violence against our own governments.
Nathan?
Yeah. Go ahead, then we'll come back to you, Brian.
My quick throw at that question is, we got challenged by the tolerance during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to take up bearer arms and all that, but just the freedom to assemble.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Nebraska, we had our laws pretty open. We did restrict a little bit there, but you take some places in our United States, like California, I'm thinking of. My goodness, their fines to the church were unbelievable in some counties.
Right.
And so one pastor said, according to that, if they would have gotten fined, he was basically standing on the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
But if they would have gotten fined, as big a church as that was, they would have went broke paying those fines, and the pastor would have been in jail. So
I would say there are times when the Bible, we're required to disobey. When Nebuchadnezzar tells Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you have to bow down, they're like, no, I'm not going. I'm going to disobey you because I have a higher king. You might kill me. That's okay because I have a higher king, right? So there are times when we have to disobey our earthly governments. I'm saying that's a different thing from trying to overthrow them.
Right.
Yeah. Brian.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, good.
Would you bet on the side of the king?
In the U.S. Revolution. We'll come to that. We'll come to that probably in the next few weeks, and we'll have a good long conversation about that. I would say that the U.S. Revolution might be the only revolution in history that things were better on the back side of it than they were on the front side of it. It's pretty unique.
Well, you weren't saying, so were you saying last week that Israel should stand down and let people hurt them? Or
No.
should they stand up and defend themselves?
There were lots of times in the Old Testament when God said, go kill the Amalekites, go kill But when you look at how those battles go, they're won and lost, not mainly on military strategy. Like they defeat Jericho by blowing horns, and then they lose to Ai when they have a far superior force. And God is continually telling them, it's not horses and chariots that are winning your battles. If you stick with me, you'll be fine. If you don't stick with me, it's not going to be fine, right? And so often that model that you see in the Old Testament is that God sends a hailstorm, or God says, Gideon, send most of your troops home, and then you're going to smash jars. Like that pattern is over and over and over in the Hebrew people's wars of the Old Testament. And I would argue that when they go to war, in a justifiable sense, it's because God said, go do this, right? If someone in our church comes to me and says, God told me that I need to go to war against the U.S. government, I would say, maybe we should talk about this a little more. Right.
I'm thinking of Saul, when God ordered Saul to go kill, you know that.
Mm-hmm.
You know exactly what I'm talking about. And
Yeah.
he didn't, he was supposed to kill the animals.
Right.
He was supposed to kill them all, the
Right.
kids and everything, and he
Right.
didn't do that.
Right.
And there was a consequence because he didn't.
Right. Yeah. All right, we're out of time. Tom, you want to pray for whatever mess I caused here?